September 15, 1943. Camp Hearn, Texas. Obergefreiter Klaus Weber clutched the small card in his trembling hands, reading the English words slowly. Library card. Camp Hearn Educational Facility. The American sergeant had handed it to him with the casual indifference of someone distributing routine supplies, but Weber stared at it as if it were a document from another world. In Nazi Germany, access to books was strictly controlled. Libraries were purged of degenerate literature beginning in 1933, when over 25,000 books were burned in Berlin alone. Reading lists were dictated by party ideology through the Reich Chamber of Literature, which maintained a list of over 12,400 banned publications. Jewish authors were forbidden, foreign works were censored, and even German classics were edited to conform to Nazi doctrine. Weber, a former bookkeeper from Munich, hadn't seen an uncensored book in 4 years. The camp library occupied an entire wooden barracks, hastily constructed but surprisingly well-appointed. As 127 newly arrived German prisoners filed through the entrance that first morning, their faces registered disbelief. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held over 3,000 volumes in multiple languages. German classics sat beside American literature, scientific journals rested next to philosophy texts, and newspapers from across America lay scattered on reading tables. Feldwebel Ernst Hoffmann, a former gymnasium teacher from Hamburg who had taught under increasingly restrictive Nazi curriculum guidelines, approached the circulation desk where an elderly American woman sat stamping books. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, a volunteer from the local Hearn community and retired librarian, looked up with a warm smile. "Guten Tag," she said in careful German. "Welcome to our library. What kind of books do you enjoy?" Hoffmann stood speechless. In Germany, librarians were required to report on readers' selections to local party officials under the Reich reading room regulations. Books were weapons in the ideological war, and access was a privilege reserved for the politically reliable. Library cards required party membership verification, and borrowing records were maintained for Gestapo review. Here, an enemy civilian was offering him unrestricted access to knowledge without political vetting. You have German books?" he asked hesitantly in broken English. Mrs. Patterson nodded enthusiastically. "Of course. Goethe, Schiller, Mann, Hesse. We also have English translations if you'd prefer to practice the language." The University of Texas donated most of our German collection when they heard about the educational program. She led him to a section where familiar spines caught his eye. Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, banned in Germany since 1933 when Mann's citizenship was revoked. Heinrich Heine's poetry, forbidden because of the author's Jewish heritage and placed on the first Nazi book-burning lists. Even remarks, All Quiet on the Western Front, considered treasonous by Nazi authorities and banned for its pacifist themes. Lieutenant Friedrich Bauer, captured with the Afrika Korps at the surrender of Tunisia, pulled a volume of Einstein's papers from the physics section. In Germany, Einstein's work had been dismissed as Jewish science by the Deutsche Physik movement led by Nobel laureates Philipp Lenard and Johannes Stark. University physics departments were required to teach Aryan physics that rejected relativity theory. Here, Einstein's complete work sat openly on the shelf next to Newton and Maxwell. "This is impossible," he whispered to Weber. "They're giving us access to everything they've forbidden us to read." The prisoners discovered that the library operated on an honor system. No guards monitored their selections, no reports were filed on their reading habits, and they could check out books for up to 2 weeks. Many had never experienced such intellectual freedom, even as civilians in pre-Nazi Germany. The Weimar Republic had maintained some censorship, but nothing approaching the comprehensive thought control implemented after 1933. Unteroffizier Hans Müller, who had worked in the Berlin State Library before conscription and witnessed the systematic purging of collections, counted the newspaper selection with growing amazement. The New York Times, Washington Post, Time Magazine, Life, Scientific American, National Geographic. Publications that would have meant imprisonment for possession in Germany were available for casual reading. Foreign newspapers had been banned since 1939, and possession of Allied publications carried a death sentence under wartime regulations. "They're showing us everything," he wrote in his secret diary that first night. Not just American propaganda, but genuine debate, criticism of their own government, discussions of problems and failures. In Germany, Such honesty would be considered treasonous defeatism. Here, it seems to be considered patriotic duty. The morning reading sessions became a revelation. Prisoners gathered around tables, quietly absorbing information that contradicted years of Nazi indoctrination. They read about American industrial capacity, democratic institutions, and scientific achievements. More shocking still, they read American criticisms of American policies, congressional debates questioning military strategy, and newspaper editorials challenging government decisions. Oberstfreiter Paul Fischer discovered a copy of The Grapes of Wrath and was astounded that Americans would publish, much less celebrate, a book that exposed national hardships. In Germany, such a book would never see print, he noted. Here, it won the Pulitzer Prize. They reveal their weaknesses publicly, and somehow this makes them stronger, not weaker. The first week's circulation records told a remarkable story. Of 127 prisoners, 89 checked out books on the first day. By the end of the week, every prisoner had visited the library at least once. The most popular selections were German literature they hadn't seen in years, followed by English primers and American newspapers. Several prisoners requested philosophy texts, scientific journals, and history books that presented perspectives banned in Nazi Germany. Mrs. Patterson observed their behavior with growing understanding. They handled books like precious objects, she later recalled. They would sit for hours reading single pages, as if afraid the books might disappear. Many wept when they found authors they had thought were lost forever. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Prisoners who had arrived sullen and defiant began engaging in animated discussions about literature, science, and philosophy. The barracks conversations shifted from military reminiscences to intellectual debates. Men who had been reduced to their military functions were rediscovering their civilian identities as thinkers, readers, and learners. Dr. Wilhelm Kruger, a chemistry professor from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute captured in the final Afrika Korps collapse, spent hours in the science section. He discovered American research that had advanced far beyond German capabilities, partly because Jewish scientists expelled from Germany had found refuge in American universities. They didn't just preserve the knowledge we rejected, he wrote. They accelerated it beyond our reach. The library catalog revealed the scope of intellectual freedom. Over 200 works by Jewish authors, including many who had fled Germany. Books on democracy, socialism, capitalism, and anarchism sat side by side without ideological segregation. Scientific works from all nations, including detailed studies of German research that had been captured or shared before the war. Lieutenant Hans Schmidt, whose father was a Nazi party Kreisleiter in Nuremberg, found himself reading Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws in German translation. In Nazi Germany, such works were banned as promoting foreign political systems. I am reading about separation of powers and checks on government authority, he wrote to his family in carefully coded language. Ideas that might help rebuild our nation after the war. The prisoners established informal reading schedules to ensure everyone had access to popular titles. They began creating handwritten catalogs of books they particularly recommended, sharing reviews, and discussing complex works in evening sessions. The library became the intellectual center of camp life, more popular than the recreation hall or the canteen. By the end of September, Mrs. Patterson reported to camp authorities that library usage exceeded all expectations. These men are hungry for knowledge, she wrote. Not just entertainment or escape, but serious intellectual engagement. They approach books with an intensity I've rarely seen, even among university students. The transformation was visible in posture, conversation, and behavior. Prisoners walked taller, spoke more thoughtfully, and engaged with American guards and civilians with intellectual curiosity rather than sullen hostility. The simple act of choosing their own reading material had begun restoring human dignity that military defeat had temporarily stripped away. October 1943. The announcement appeared on bulletin boards throughout Camp Herne, typed in both English and German. English language classes, beginning, intermediate, and advanced levels. Voluntary participation. Classes begin Monday, 0800 hours. Instructor, Professor Sarah Mitchell, Sam Houston State Teachers College. Lieutenant Bauer read the notice with deep skepticism. In German camps, education meant indoctrination. Classes were mandatory ideological sessions designed to reinforce Nazi doctrine through the National Socialist Teachers League curriculum. Attendance was recorded, participation was monitored, and dissent was punished. The concept of voluntary learning seemed suspicious, possibly a trick to identify intellectual dissidents or potential collaborators. But curiosity overcame caution. On Monday morning, 89 prisoners gathered in the converted mess hall that served as a classroom. Their instructor was not a military officer or political commissar, but a middle-aged woman with graying hair and kind eyes. Professor Sarah Mitchell had driven 45 miles from Huntsville, Texas, leaving her home at 6 a.m. to reach the camp by 8 a.m. Professor Mitchell had volunteered for the program through the War Department's Special Projects Division, which coordinated civilian participation in prisoner re-education efforts. She carried no weapons, had no guards, and possessed no authority beyond her knowledge and teaching credentials. In Nazi Germany, such vulnerability would have been seen as weakness inviting exploitation. Here, it represented confidence in the fundamental decency of human nature. "Good morning, gentlemen." She began in clear, simple English, writing her name on the blackboard with careful letters. "My name is Professor Mitchell. I am here to help you learn English, not to change your politics or your beliefs. Language is a tool, nothing more. What you do with this tool is entirely your choice." The prisoners exchanged glances. Educational neutrality was unknown in Nazi Germany, where every lesson carried political content mandated by the Reich Ministry of Education. Teachers were required to integrate Nazi ideology into mathematics, science, literature, and even physical education. Professor Mitchell's approach was revolutionary. She taught grammar without ideology, vocabulary without propaganda. Feldwebel Hoffman, with his teaching background, recognized the pedagogical sophistication immediately. Professor Mitchell used visual aids, repetition exercises, and conversational practice that far exceeded German language instruction methods. More remarkably, she encouraged questions, welcomed mistakes, and showed infinite patience with struggling students. In Nazi classrooms, errors were signs of racial or ideological deficiency. Here, they were natural parts of learning. In Germany, Hoffman wrote to his wife in a letter that passed American censors. Teachers demanded perfect recitation of approved texts. Professor Mitchell wants us to think, to experiment with language, to make errors and learn from them. She treats us not as vessels to be filled with information, but as minds to be developed. The first lessons focused on practical vocabulary, numbers, colors, common objects, basic verbs. But Professor Mitchell's teaching philosophy emerged in her methods. She presented multiple ways to express the same idea, explained regional variations in American English, and encouraged students to find their own preferred learning techniques. This respect for individual learning styles contradicted Nazi educational theory, which emphasized conformity and standardization. The English classes revealed American educational philosophy through practice rather than theory. Students were encouraged to express opinions, even controversial ones. When Obergefreiter Weber questioned American democracy during a vocabulary exercise about government, Professor Mitchell didn't punish or correct him. Instead, she used his comment as a teaching opportunity, expanding the lesson to include political vocabulary while maintaining strict neutrality about political systems. "She never told us what to think," Weber recalled decades later in interviews with historians. "She gave us the tools to think in English. Then let us reach our own conclusions." This respect for individual judgment was completely foreign to our experience in Nazi education systems. By November, enrollment had grown to 156 prisoners from across the camp's population. Word spread that Professor Mitchell's classes were genuinely educational rather than propagandistic. Advanced students began helping beginners, creating a collaborative learning environment that defied military hierarchy. Officers and enlisted men sat side by side, learning together without regard for rank. The classes expanded beyond basic language instruction to include mathematics, science, and history. Professor Mitchell recruited colleagues from Sam Houston State Teachers College to volunteer as additional instructors. Dr. James Harrison taught American history, Dr. Mary Caldwell taught mathematics, and Dr. Robert Chun, a Chinese-American chemistry professor, taught basic sciences. Prisoner volunteers with university backgrounds served as teaching assistants. Dr. Wilhelm Kruger found himself teaching basic chemistry to fellow prisoners under American supervision. The American educational approach astounded him. Rather than memorizing approved formulas, students were encouraged to experiment, to question established principles, and to pursue independent research. The camp provided laboratory equipment that many German universities lacked due to wartime shortages. They gave enemy prisoners better educational resources than our own students received, Dr. Kruger noted in letters to his former colleagues at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. Microscopes, chemical reagents, mathematical instruments. They invested in our intellectual development while we were technically their enemies. The mathematics classes proved particularly popular among technically trained prisoners. Dr. Caldwell presented advanced calculus, statistics, and engineering mathematics that many prisoners had never encountered. She encouraged original problem-solving rather than rote memorization, fostering creativity that Nazi education had systematically suppressed. Unteroffizier Franz Richter, a former mechanic from the Ruhr Valley, discovered aptitude for engineering mathematics through Dr. Caldwell's patient instruction. She saw potential I didn't know I possessed, he wrote. In Germany, my social class determined my educational opportunities. Here, only my ability and effort mattered. The history classes proved most challenging to Nazi-indoctrinated minds. Professor Harrison presented multiple perspectives on historical events, including German viewpoints and legitimate grievances. He discussed World War I without demonizing Germany, analyzed economic systems without ideological bias, and examined social problems in both nations objectively. Lieutenant Hans Schmidt, whose father was a Nazi party official in Nuremberg, wrote in amazement, Professor Harrison taught us about the American Civil War, including criticism of Northern policies and acknowledgement of Southern grievances. He presented the Confederate perspective fairly, even though it contradicted current American government positions. Such academic honesty is impossible under totalitarian rule. The teaching methods emphasized critical thinking over memorization. Students were assigned research projects, encouraged to debate different viewpoints, and required to support arguments with evidence rather than ideology. Many prisoners encountered the Socratic method for the first time, learning to question assumptions and examine ideas systematically. Professor Mitchell noticed the transformation in her students' questions. Early sessions focused on basic vocabulary and pronunciation. By December, discussions involved complex philosophical concepts, scientific theories, and political analysis. They weren't just learning English, she recalled in post-war interviews. They were learning to think in democratic terms, to question authority, and to value evidence over assertion. The classroom environment fostered intellectual curiosity that many prisoners had suppressed for years. Nazi education discouraged independent thought, original research, and creative expression. American educational methods encouraged exactly these qualities, treating each student as an individual capable of contributing unique insights. Dr. Chen's chemistry classes particularly impressed technically trained prisoners. He encouraged experimentation, welcomed failed hypotheses, and treated scientific errors as learning opportunities. In Germany, failed experiments meant incompetence, Dr. Kruger observed. Here, they meant discovery. The voluntary nature of the program eliminated coercion that had characterized German education. Students attended because they wanted to learn, not because they feared punishment. This motivation produced remarkable results. Attendance rates exceeded 90%, homework was completed enthusiastically, and students often stayed after class for additional discussion. Professor Mitchell established study groups for advanced students who wanted to pursue specialized subjects. These groups operated independently, with minimal supervision, fostering intellectual independence and collaborative learning. Prisoners organized their own seminars, debates, and research projects without outside direction. The educational program's success exceeded all expectations. Camp authorities reported dramatic improvements in prisoner morale, behavior, and cooperation. Educational engagement reduced disciplinary problems, escape attempts, and inter-prisoner conflicts. Learning had restored dignity and purpose to men who had lost both in military defeat. Winter 1943 to 1944. The transformation was subtle but profound. Prisoners who had arrived as indoctrinated soldiers were becoming critical thinkers. The combination of unrestricted reading and quality education was producing unexpected results that would reshape their understanding of knowledge, authority, and human potential. Evening discussions in the barracks took on new character. Instead of rehashing Nazi talking points or dwelling on military defeats, prisoners debated ideas they had encountered in books and classes. Oberstfreiter Mueller led informal philosophy sessions, exploring concepts of individual rights, democratic governance, and scientific method that had been forbidden topics under Nazi rule. We read Locke, Jefferson, and Mill, he recorded in his expanding diary, not as enemy propaganda to be rejected, but as serious political philosophy to be understood and evaluated. The Americans made no attempt to force acceptance of these ideas. They simply made them available and let us judge for ourselves. The philosophical discussions revealed the intellectual poverty of Nazi ideology. Prisoners who had been taught that democracy was weak and chaotic discovered sophisticated theories of representative government, constitutional law, and individual rights. They found that democratic philosophy addressed complex problems through reason and debate rather than force and dogma. Lieutenant Bauer, now fluent in English after 3 months of intensive study, began corresponding with American academics who had read his articles in the camp newspaper. Dr. William Thompson from MIT had written to commend Bauer's analysis of thermodynamics applications in engineering. This intellectual exchange between enemies during wartime violated every principle of Nazi ideology, yet the Americans encouraged it. They treated us as colleagues, not enemies, Bauer wrote to his wife. Professor Thompson sent me advanced mathematics texts and engaged in scholarly debate about theoretical physics. This collegiality transcended national boundaries and revealed the universal nature of academic pursuit. The scientific education particularly impressed technically trained prisoners. Dr. Kruger collaborated with American researchers on chemical projects, contributing to studies that would benefit both nations' post-war reconstruction. His research on synthetic materials, conducted while technically a prisoner of war, was published in American chemical journals under his own name. In Germany, science served ideology, Dr. Kruger explained in detailed letters to former colleagues. Research that contradicted party doctrine was forbidden, and scientists were required to support predetermined conclusions. Here, I was encouraged to pursue pure research, to challenge established theories, and to publish findings that might even assist German post-war reconstruction. The prisoners established their own study groups, book clubs, and discussion societies that operated with minimal American supervision. The camp newspaper, Der Ruf, The Call, evolved from a simple news bulletin into a sophisticated publication featuring literary criticism, scientific articles, and philosophical essays. American authorities exercised no censorship beyond basic security requirements about troop movements and military installations. Dr. Harrison's history classes had introduced prisoners to American academic standards of evidence and argumentation. They learned to distinguish between primary and secondary sources, to evaluate historical claims critically, and to support arguments with documented evidence. These skills transformed their approach to all subjects, from science to literature to philosophy. The camp library expanded to 4,200 volumes by Christmas 1943, with donations from universities, churches, and private citizens across Texas and neighboring states. Prisoners had access to current scientific journals, allowing them to maintain currency with developments in their fields. This intellectual generosity from enemies bewildered minds conditioned to expect exploitation and propaganda. They could have let us stagnate, wrote Dr. Kruger. Instead, they ensured we remained intellectually vital, academically current, and professionally competent. This investment in enemy human capital demonstrated confidence we had never encountered in any educational system. The educational programs attracted voluntary participation from 847 prisoners, nearly 90% of the camp population. Waiting lists developed for advanced courses as word spread about the quality of instruction and the intellectual freedom it provided. Some prisoners completed entire university-level curricula while in captivity, earning certificates from American institutions that would be honored in post-war Germany. Unteroffizier Franz Richter, the former mechanic who had discovered engineering aptitude, now assisted Dr. Caldwell in teaching basic mathematics to new arrivals. His transformation from manual labor to technical instructor demonstrated the democratic principle that education should be available to all social classes rather than reserved for elites. They invested in my intellectual development, he reflected in letters to his family, knowing I would return to Germany as a competitor, not an ally. This investment in human potential, regardless of nationality or social origin, revealed the true strength of democratic society. The educational program produced measurable results. English fluency rates among long-term prisoners exceeded 80%. Mathematical competency increased dramatically among prisoners who had received only basic education in Germany. Scientific literacy expanded as prisoners learned research methods and critical thinking skills. But the most significant changes were qualitative. Feldwebel Hoffmann, who had arrived as a committed Nazi educator, was now writing essays about democratic education for Der Ruf. His analysis of American pedagogical methods, comparing them favorably to German authoritarian teaching, would later influence West German educational reform in the 1950s. I came to understand that education and indoctrination are opposites, he wrote in an essay that circulated throughout the camp. The Americans educated us by providing tools for independent thought. The Nazis indoctrinated us by providing approved conclusions. The difference is the foundation of freedom versus tyranny. The intellectual awakening extended beyond formal classes and structured reading. Prisoners organized their own seminars on specialized subjects, from advanced mathematics to medieval literature to modern philosophy. These self-directed learning groups operated without American supervision, demonstrating the prisoners' growing intellectual independence. Dr. Chen's chemistry laboratory became a center for original research. Prisoners with scientific backgrounds collaborated on projects ranging from materials science to agricultural chemistry. Their work contributed to American research efforts while advancing their own understanding of scientific method and international cooperation. The transformation was visible in prisoner behavior and attitudes. Disciplinary problems decreased as intellectual engagement provided positive outlets for energy and frustration. Escape attempts virtually ceased as prisoners found value in their educational opportunities. Interprisoner conflicts diminished as shared learning experiences created bonds that transcended military hierarchy and regional differences. Professor Mitchell noticed the change in her students' questions and discussions. Early sessions had focused on basic communication and practical needs. By early 1944, conversations involved abstract concepts, theoretical problems, and philosophical speculation. They had rediscovered intellectual curiosity, she observed. The spark of learning that authoritarian education had nearly extinguished. The prisoners began preparing for post-war life with confidence rather than despair. They understood that their educational experiences would qualify them for leadership roles in reconstructed Germany. Many planned to continue their studies after repatriation, using skills and knowledge gained in American captivity to contribute to democratic reconstruction. Letters home, carefully written to pass censorship, carried subtle messages about educational opportunities and intellectual growth. Families in Germany began to understand that captivity in America was providing their sons and husbands with educational advantages unavailable in wartime Germany. Some wives requested that their husbands remain in captivity longer to complete their studies. The winter of 1943 to 1944 marked the completion of intellectual transformation. Prisoners who had arrived as products of Nazi education had become advocates for democratic learning. They had experienced academic freedom, intellectual respect, and educational opportunity that revealed the poverty of authoritarian systems. The seeds of post-war German educational reform were already germinating in the minds of men who would return as democratic citizens rather than defeated soldiers. Spring 1944. As Allied forces prepared for D-Day, German prisoners in American camps were undergoing their own invasion, an intellectual assault on Nazi ideology more effective than any military campaign. The transformation was now complete and measurable, documented in camp records, prisoner correspondence, and academic achievements that would reshape post-war Germany. The educational program's success exceeded all expectations and international precedents for prisoner treatment. Camp surveys conducted by the War Department's Special Projects Division showed that 73% of prisoners enrolled in educational programs had significantly modified their political views. Library circulation averaged 2.3 books per prisoner weekly, with some individuals reading over 200 books during their captivity. English fluency rates exceeded 80% among long-term prisoners, and many achieved near-native proficiency. But the most profound changes were qualitative and would prove historically significant. Feldwebel Hoffmann, who had arrived as a committed Nazi educator responsible for indoctrinating German youth, was now writing detailed analyses of democratic education for Der Ruf. His comparative studies of American and German pedagogical methods would later influence West German educational reform and help establish democratic principles in reconstructed German schools. I came to understand that education and indoctrination are opposite forces, he wrote in an essay that was translated and distributed to American educators. The Americans educated us by providing tools for independent thought, encouraging questions, and respecting individual judgment. The Nazis indoctrinated us by providing approved conclusions, discouraging inquiry, and demanding conformity. The difference represents the foundation of freedom versus tyranny. Professor Mitchell noticed the transformation in her students' intellectual development. Early sessions had focused on basic vocabulary and grammar exercises. By spring 1944, discussions involved complex philosophical concepts, scientific theories, and political analysis conducted entirely in English. They weren't just learning a language, she recalled in post-war interviews. They were learning to think in democratic terms, to question authority systematically, and to value evidence over assertion. The prisoners began preparing for post-war reconstruction while still technically enemies of the United States. Study groups focused on democratic governance, constitutional law, market economics, and educational reform. American instructors provided advanced courses in public administration, civil engineering, and agricultural science specifically designed to assist German reconstruction efforts. Dr. Harrison's advanced seminar on constitutional government attracted 47 prisoners who studied American, British, and French democratic institutions in detail. They analyzed the Weimar Republic's failures, examined successful democratic transitions in other nations, and developed theoretical frameworks for implementing democratic governance in defeated Germany. Lieutenant Schmidt, whose father remained a Nazi Kreisleiter in Nuremberg, struggled with the intellectual conflict between family loyalty and democratic conviction. His letters home, carefully crafted to avoid endangering his family while sharing new perspectives, attempted to prepare relatives for Germany's democratic future. I am learning governmental and economic principles that will help rebuild our nation, he wrote in coded language. The ideas I study here represent humanity's best hope for preventing future wars and ensuring prosperity for all citizens, regardless of their origins or beliefs. The educational program produced graduates qualified for leadership roles in post-war Germany. Dr. Kruger completed advanced studies in industrial chemistry that would prove crucial for German economic reconstruction. Richter earned certification in engineering that qualified him for technical leadership positions. Hoffmann developed expertise in democratic education that would help reform German schools. American authorities began specialized repatriation training in early 1944, recognizing that educated prisoners would play crucial roles in occupied Germany. The curriculum included intensive courses in democratic institutions, constitutional governance, civil rights, and economic planning. Prisoners studied reconstruction models from other nations and developed detailed plans for implementing democratic reforms. They prepared us to return not as defeated enemies seeking revenge, but as democratic citizens committed to peaceful reconstruction, wrote Obergefreiter Weber. The books we read, the classes we attended, the discussions we held, all were designed to prepare us for the Germany that would emerge from military defeat. The camp library's final circulation statistics documented the scope of intellectual transformation. Over 18 months, 847 prisoners checked out 89,000 books, averaging 5.2 books per prisoner monthly. The most popular categories were political philosophy, scientific journals, German literature, and American history. 0 incidents of book destruction or theft occurred, with perfect return rates on borrowed materials. Dr. Chen's chemistry laboratory produced original research that contributed to both American and international scientific knowledge. Prisoner collaborators published papers in American journals, participated in academic conferences through correspondence, and developed innovations that would benefit post-war reconstruction in Europe. The transformation extended beyond formal education to personal relationships and cultural understanding. Many prisoners maintained correspondence with American families who had befriended them through church and community programs. These relationships, continued for decades after the war, created lasting bonds between former enemies. Professor Mitchell developed friendships with several prisoners that continued through extensive correspondence after repatriation. They taught me as much as I taught them, she reflected. Their perspectives on literature, philosophy, and human nature enriched my own understanding and made me a better educator. When repatriation began in 1945, prisoners packed their few personal possessions alongside thick notebooks filled with educational materials, research projects, and detailed plans for democratic reconstruction. Many carried English-German dictionaries purchased with camp wages and textbooks donated by American instructors. The last entry in the camp library log, written by Lieutenant Bauer before departing for Germany, captured the essence of transformation. We arrived as soldiers of the Reich, convinced of our superiority and your weakness. We leave as students of democracy, humbled by your generosity and inspired by your confidence in human potential. You defeated us not through force alone, but through the power of free inquiry and intellectual respect. These lessons will help rebuild Germany as a peaceful, democratic nation. Professor Mitchell watched the final transport depart with profound satisfaction and some sadness. We didn't convert them to American values through propaganda, she reflected years later. We simply showed them what free education could accomplish when it respected human dignity and individual potential. They chose their own transformation. The German prisoners returned to a devastated homeland carrying more than personal effects and memories. They brought concrete plans for democratic reconstruction, educational reform, and economic development based on principles learned in American captivity. Many became teachers, professors, administrators, and political leaders in the new Federal Republic of Germany. The library books remained in Texas, but the ideas traveled across the Atlantic to influence an entire generation. In the rebuilt universities of West Germany, former prisoners established educational philosophies based on principles learned in American camps: academic freedom, intellectual curiosity, respect for diverse perspectives, and commitment to evidence-based reasoning. Hans Kroll, who had been held at Camp Herne and earned a certificate in political science, became West German ambassador to the United States in 1958. Walter Hallstein, who had taught philosophy classes to fellow prisoners, became the first president of the European Commission. Rüdiger von Wechmer, who had completed advanced studies in international law, served as German permanent representative to the United Nations. They brought American educational methods to German institutions, American efficiency to German administration, and American democratic ideals to German politics. The economic miracle of the 1950s was built partly on knowledge gained in American prison camps, where enemy soldiers had learned that prosperity came from freedom rather than conquest. The transformation was complete and historically significant. Soldiers who had arrived believing in racial superiority and intellectual control departed convinced of human equality and educational freedom. The most effective defeat of Nazi ideology occurred not on battlefields, but in classrooms and libraries where enemy prisoners discovered the transformative power of democratic education. Years later, when German students enjoyed intellectual freedom in democratic universities, few knew the foundations had been laid by their fathers and grandfathers who had learned to read freely and think independently in American prison camps. The greatest victory was invisible but lasting: the conversion of closed minds into open ones, of indoctrinated soldiers into educated citizens, of former enemies into democratic allies. The library card that Obergefreiter Weber had clutched in September 1943 became a symbol of liberation. In his post-war memoirs, published in 1965, he wrote, "That small piece of paper represented more than access to books. It represented trust in human judgment, confidence in democratic values, and belief in the transformative power of education. It was my first lesson in freedom, and it changed the course of my life and my nation's future."